You most certainly do.
We've only got 2 out of 3, so this will be express service unless you all have questions. We're not going to go on forever.
Our third participant is not here today, but just for the record, this panel is pushing the envelope of divisiveness, hate speech in the 1990s. This is Bob Glenn from Owensboro Community College, and his presentation is titled Entertainers or Hate Mongers, Talk Radio Hosts as Instigators of Partisan Confrontation. I'm Jim Ruppert from Southern Arkansas University, and my presentation, including an edited video, which you'll see later, is titled Bigotry is Not Monochromatic, Contemporary Provocateurs of Racial Hate Speech. Bob?
The first thing that comes to mind, I want to take you back to a period when FM radio began to dominate the airwaves, basically in the mid to late 70s, and the AM band became a virtual wasteland of country music, pop favorites, Barry Manilow, and to a lesser extent, the golden moldy oldies. While FM radio emerged with the sports talk format, the news talk format, the news radio format, which KNX in Los Angeles is one of the pioneers of, along with WNBC in New York. WFAN radio in New York is one of the hallmarks of sports talk radio. And today, when AM is successful, they have taken the talk radio format to heart and have transferred it, but FM radio still dominates the dial. The second event occurred during the second term of the Reagan administration, when the Fairness Doctrine and a lot of federal communications regulations concerning content of such things as personal attacks or critical attacks on institutions were waived. Initially, the initial transformation allowed for just minor fines to be paid by individuals who humorously or directly slandered an individual as part of, say, a radio routine. And now, during the Bush administration, those fines have virtually disappeared, at least in terms of enforcement. They may be on the books, but they don't get enforced. And so you have, in my area, as probably in yours, in my particular region of the country, in Kentucky, we pick up one program that I actually do enjoy listening to, and probably because it's a male-oriented program, Tom and Bob, and they are a satellite feed out of Indianapolis. Satellite radio is the third causation that has allowed us to become more unified in terms of these talk programs. A lot of programs like Rush Limbaugh got his start on a Sacramento radio station, and then he proved so popular he expanded to Northern California, and then from there he went national in the early 1980s. And so usually it starts out with somebody who's real popular in a local area, and they bust out because of the ability for syndication to occur, which has expanded with the ability of more and more large companies to own multiple radio stations. There used to be a limit, 5 radio stations and 5 TV stations, and now those limits, in fact, there's a recent law, in fact, that will almost totally obliterate that to the point where they can earn a particular company can own up to 40 different stations, both AM and FM. So the ability for there to be major corporations owning many, many stations means that syndication has taken hold in radio, just as it had already had in television for years. And the second issue, of course, is the content of those programs, which is the focus of my discussion. So I'm going to look basically at 3 major players in the talk show wars: Don Imus, Michael Reagan, and G. Gordon Liddy. I left Rush Limbaugh out, much and all as I would like to talk about it, because I think Jim is probably going to touch on that a little bit, or he probably has more knowledge with Rush than I do. So there is one error on my outline I have that radio stations, my second point is that, or first point is that some lesser markets are canceling Rush and Limbaugh. What that should read is that they are canceling Limbaugh and Liddy. They tend to be, they're syndicated by different groups, but they tend to be a package, not Rush and Limbaugh. Let me give you an example of the lesser markets. Lesser markets would be defined as markets serving less than 200,000 listeners, and basically being in a situation where what is happening is that, particularly after the 1996 election, Rush Limbaugh's ratings have dipped considerably. His TV show's already off the air. G. Gordon Liddy has enjoyed quite a bit of popularity after his comments that you should shoot AFT agents, alcohol, tobacco and firearms, ATF agents, in the head because they wore body armor. This was a couple of years ago, and basically after that furor erupted, his ratings perversely went up. More people wanted to hear this madman, this former Watergate co-conspirator who spent time in prison, former sort of leatherneck FBI tough guy, and now his ratings have started to plateau. They haven't really dipped, but they've plateaued. Most of these three gentlemen, Imus, Reagan, and Liddy, are very, very popular with males, age 18 to 54. Liddy in particular is very big with people age 18 to 54. One of the reasons is they tend to talk about political issues. They tend to talk about them from I'd say a monocultural view, and by that I mean that they pretty much look at it as the angry white male looks at society. Of the three, in terms of political spectrum, I would say that certainly G. Gordon Liddy is far more conservative and somewhat more paranoid than almost anybody else on the air, except maybe for some local radio hosts. As far as the syndicated people, he's probably the most paranoid. He tended to fall more, he was much more willing to trumpet and actually, if you will, be a shill for the claims that, for instance, that Vincent Foster had been assassinated rather than meeting his demise at his own hand. That Hillary Clinton and Vince Foster were having an affair. Those kinds of interesting little side scandals that were perpetuated by the Christian Coalition, or members of it at least, and also by people like Jerry Falwell, who produced videos to the effect that Vincent Foster was murdered. Liddy was a willing accomplice in promoting those as if they were true. Conversely, I would say that Michael Reagan's in the middle. He recently declared as an independent from his status as Republican. Of course, Michael Reagan is the son of former President Ronald Reagan. I have heard him quite a bit. Working on my doctorate, I drove back and forth between Kentucky and Mississippi repeatedly, and WTN in Nashville is a flagship station, and they broadcast all these people, including Michael Reagan. Michael Reagan is clearly the more moderate. What Michael Reagan's strategy, as I'll discuss in a moment, is more to let his guests do the heavy hitting, and he just asks the questions. So he comes across as very moderate in tone, certainly doesn't really play into the pandering to some of the paranoid theories about what's going on in politics, but occasionally he will allow guests to bash people pretty well. He had on, I'm trying to remember his name, the rock and roller, Ted Nugent, of all people. And Ted Nugent is a hunter, and Ted Nugent is, perversely, a conservative Republican. And he had him on. I don't quite know why. I think Nugent was going to testify on Capitol Hill concerning hunters' rights. And he allowed Nugent repeatedly to refer to Bill and Hill as a couple of idiots and use four-letter words. And this is Michael Reagan. But he was very diplomatic. So how do you feel about Bill and Hillary, really, And Ted Nugent would let forth with, they're a bunch of jerks, I can't stand them. If I saw them in if I were in my hunter's blind and they were out there, they'd be dead, But Reagan himself, unlike G. Gordon Liddy, the contrast is he doesn't do the attacking himself. He lets the attack dogs loose, but he is not the attack dog. Whereas with G. Gordon Liddy is the attack dog, and then when he has guests, it's like a whole gang of them, a wolf pack, if you will, in terms of what they do to some of the subjects and individuals that they cannibalize on the air. Finally, on another level, there's Don Imus. Now, Don Imus, interestingly enough, is almost apolitical at times. He is equally adept at attacking Newt Gingrich in one fell swoop and then attacking Bill Clinton. Of course, his ratings continue to rise. He has not plateaued yet. He, of course, is co-aired on MSNBC in some markets from 5 to 8 a.m. in the morning. Of course, he's based in New York. He's had a very turbulent career. He's been through drug rehab several times. He's a very eclectic individual. He does a lot of characters and a lot of different routines. He's a little like Tom and Bob in that regard. A lot of pre-canned material that's already taped, he'll play. And something that Rush in the last 5 years has really gotten into, characters and scenes, and a lot of prepared material, not as much live material or presentations. And that seems to work real well for Imus. It's what he does best. But he is scathing. He is red hot in his criticism, and sometimes he is almost too personal in his criticism. At a correspondence dinner, a very fancy Washington event, approximately, I think it's been a year now, maybe a year and a half ago, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were in the audience, and you may be aware of this, of course, and he made a great deal of fun while the president was in attendance and got a great deal of criticism for making fun of the president's weight, making fun of the president's supposed dalliances with other women, and this was considered in bad taste. But MSNBC, as well as his anchor station WNBC in New York, said, that's not Imus. You knew what you were getting when he showed up. You invited him. And it's just a no-holds-barred thing. He will make fun of his guests. On the other hand, what Imus gets a great deal of credit for is allowing political officials, such as, from diverse backgrounds, somebody like Alphonse D'Amato, a conservative Republican, and Bill Bradley of New Jersey when he was still a senator, get them on the air and really get them to let their hair down, really get them to allow them to demonstrate their true personality, to be themselves, much more so than on any other format. In another sense, with Imus, he was also able to get Bill Clinton during his runs for the presidency, both in 1992 and early in 1996, to come on and be interviewed. And so he has a tremendous collection of Washington journalists, Jeff Greenfield, Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite, who have all been on his show. He is very well connected, and I'd say he's almost the Larry King of talk radio, because he is very, very good at generating an excellent guest list. And he gets high marks for that. On the other hand, there are some who refuse to ever go on his show again because of some of his off-the-air antics, such as his criticism of the Clintons during the dinner. So I would basically say that Imus, in terms of that political spectrum, again, he's probably in the middle, where you have Michael Reagan, who's sort of off in the hinterlands. He's sort of an independent, but he's not an arch-conservative Republican. And then you have Liddy, who's on the far right, and then you've got Imus, who's probably more liberal than the two of them. So I guess he's not in the middle, I should say. He's probably more over to the left, but yet he ranges. You know, his political attitudes are sometimes very hard to discern, because he is equally adept at attacking both Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, and the like. And his political satire is in the vein of Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce, and he's very profane. And in fact, he's called the baby Howard Stern. Stern is I believe, in the same package with him, produced by the same people. And so some say that he's just Howard Stern with a better political mind. And there may be some truth to that. That's basically enough on Don Imus. Let's talk about G. Gordon Liddy. Liddy's program began in 1992. Of course, G. Gordon Liddy has a very storied past. In his, I believe, an unauthorized autobiography, Will, there's the story of him holding his hand over a live candle to demonstrate how macho he is. There's the rather bizarre wardrobe. He wanders around in trench coats looking akin to a CIA agent. I think I will give him credit. He was on WTN quite a bit as well. He's probably got the best vocabulary of anybody I've ever heard on radio. He's very intelligent. The problem is he selects, if you consider it a problem, if you're a right-wing conservative, you lap it up. But if you're not really sure about some of this stuff, he doesn't tend to rely on real credible sources for some of the stories he promotes. He tends to pick up on radical fringe stories, as I described earlier, such as the Clinton Chronicle stuff that indicated Vince Foster had been killed, or that Hillary and Vince were having a dalliance, or of all things, that Chelsea was being allowed to date while being with Seeker. Really bizarre stuff. And actually criticized Chelsea at one point for her hair, which was really kind of out of bounds. Hillary wrote him a letter about that. Those kinds of things. He goes well beyond the limits. Imus can be tasteless, but Liddy is actually sounds at least superficially very serious in his attacks on the Clintons, as if he views his orientation or his platform as a way of bringing down Democratic politicians, and it's clearly imbalanced to that side. Big promoter of Republican politics. He calls his show Radio Free DC, and its flagship station is WJFK in Washington. Liddy is growing in certain areas of the country. His audience is still growing in the West and Southeast, which is natural. They tend to be the more conservative, political, polar sites in the country. Like Imus, he's referred to by a little nickname. Imus is known as the I-Man, and I don't know whether this was his producer's idea or his, but he's called the G-Man, which makes sense with his FBI and Treasury agent background. And he is hugely popular, again, with men ages 18 to 54, according to recent Arbitron ratings. Interestingly enough, the true talk radio format, and there are stations that at one point were literally producing wall-to-wall talk radio coverage, where you start out with Rush Limbaugh in the morning, you might get Paul Harvey sandwiched in there, and then you would have all these people: Michael Reagan, G. Gordon Liddy, Oliver North. Don Imus tends to be a unique sort of thing. He tends to be something that non-talk radio, those stations that use talk radio just as a warm-up in the morning and then have music the rest of the day, they tend to use him. But there are a whole group of these talk show hosts, and they tend, even though they're produced by different groups, to get packaged in a group. WTN in Nashville is a real good example of that. KMBC in Los Angeles, where Michael Reagan, that was his flagship station in Orange County, California. Michael Reagan got his start there. And actually, Michael Reagan, particularly in the West, is one of the fastest growing talk show programs. Partly because he gets, I think his analysis is much more cleaner. I guess we should talk about him now. He has got a lot of credibility because he does adopt a moderate tone. He lets his guests do the savaging of issues and personalities. He basically focuses on issues of concern, not just to Republicans, but to everybody. I mean, he talked about health care reform and had a couple of people on, both Republican and Democrat, and I thought they had a real thoughtful discussion about why Clinton had a good idea, but he went overboard, and that if anybody but Clinton had proposed some of the health care reforms, they might have gotten through, but the fact that he made Hillary the point person and all of this. Really, that's the one person, interestingly enough, that Michael Reagan does routinely savage, and that is Hillary Clinton. He doesn't seem to be real impressed with her and tends to make fun of her. There's a lot of reverentially references to his father, Ronald Reagan, but you should know that they were not close. Ronald Reagan routinely ignored his son's existence. Of course, Michael Reagan is, as I recall, I hope this is right, I believe he is a stepson. He is not a natural son. Adopted, yes, pardon me, he's adopted. And that apparently has caused a difference. Of course, when you're a politician, you're not around for family get-togethers much anyway, but Ronald Reagan went out of his way to miss things like Michael Reagan's football career in high school and to basically pretend he didn't exist until about his 21st birthday. So that's caused some estrangement, but the Reagan name clearly has helped him get a talk show. He had been a Republican operative and done some work with the Republican Party prior to getting the talk show, but he's probably one of the fastest growing people. Now, just to close, I'd say the last three things I want to add here real quickly are one person that is meeting his demise rather quickly in terms of ratings is Oliver North. There's the idea versus the reality of Oliver North as a talk show host. We all remember Ollie standing in his Marine dress uniform in, I believe, 1983, maybe 7, testifying in the Iran-Contra hearings. And putting on a very dramatic performance, aided and abetted greatly by his credibility as a Marine officer. But the problem with Oliver North, both as a political candidate in his ill-fated run for the Senate against Charles Robb, and as a talk show host, is that Ollie's downright boring. He was on WTN and was canceled after about 6 weeks. One of the big problems Oliver North had is people would call up, and he's a very argumentative individual, and even people who were even in the same political frame as he was, a conservative Republican, he would argue with them about facts and statistics, and it was not uncommon in the exposure I got to him for people who had called up basically to be, ditto heads, to use the Rush Limbaugh term, to hang up abruptly or go, oh, okay, and you could kind of tell they were kind of shocked. Their hero was criticizing them on the air, and that was a real problem. And unlike Imus, and even to a lesser extent, unlike G. Gordon Liddy, North has real problems gaining and gathering individuals who will come on his program and talk, because what happens with Oliver North is he's not a very good interviewer, and he winds up basically commanding the stage even when he is a guest. And so he doesn't just ask a question and let the guest carry it like Michael Reagan does. Actually, Michael Reagan's an excellent interviewer, and Don Imus is an excellent interviewer, although he likes to get his jabs in during the course of the interview. North isn't. And this is hurting him in several major markets. He's already been canceled. In our market, they canceled one of our stations, WOMI, had an all-talk radio format supplemented with news, and they have trashed the whole thing. in large part because Limbaugh's ratings had been going down. They had Oliver North on, he was just a disaster. And they were getting, even though Liddy's ratings were pretty stable, they were getting a lot of negative feedback. They had people protesting the station after his remarks about the ATF agents about 2 years ago. And he was just getting to the point where he was more of an embarrassment than he was worth. And there's also some investigatory things going on because the Clinton administration, obviously, at one point, Bill Clinton, threw up his hands and said, "Talk radio hosts are ruining America." These people are, promoting an environment of hate, which is the title of our program, which probably didn't seem like a bright idea at the time. But in tandem with that, Clinton also authorized several investigations of the content of these programs, and it's looking like the fines that hadn't been enforced during the Reagan and Bush years are going to quickly accrue. And if these are like your IRS back taxes, if you're a radio station subscribing to Oliver North and he has to pay a fine, you might get to pay it too, because you help generate or feed the transmission to an audience. And I think that also is leading to the demise of this particular format. It's still hot, but some of its biggest stars like Limbaugh and to a lesser extent somebody like Oliver North are beginning to show some chinks in their armor. So I think talk radio is an interesting format. I think, though, it's like talk TV. It's beginning to reach a saturation point. We had talk TV. It seemed like everybody but Mickey Mouse was having a talk show, it came to the zenith when Chevy Chase had a talk show. I thought that was about all I could stand. Was Chevy Chase, who would never takes himself seriously, wants us to view him as a serious interviewer. But the situation with radio is that with radio, you have to have somebody who is really good at interviewing. You have to have somebody who is an interesting, dynamic personality, somebody who comes across well. And thirdly, you have to have somebody who can attract a good stable of guests, because you don't want to hear one voice for 3 and 4 hour chunks, which is what the length of most of these programs. Now, certain markets will buy just an hour or two. Rush Limbaugh has 3 different listener packages that you can purchase. Some people take like his 1 hour, coffee chat where he just goes through the news. Others take the full 4 hour time block and fill a third of their daily programming with it, and either put it in drive time coming home or the morning rush hour time to catch people. But this is one of these things where talk radio is going to have to shake out in the next couple of years. And of course, on the other end of the spectrum, liberals and people who are considered to be liberal, or at least moderate Democrats, if you will, people in the moderate part of the political spectrum are still struggling to gain a foothold in that medium. James Carville, I think, has developed a radio program, and he is on the air. Of course, Jesse Jackson had a radio program for a while, and then a television program.
Mary Madeline.
And Mary Madeline, but I don't know whether you count her as, she's a moderate Republican, I guess. She also has done a radio program. So there probably needs to be more balance in this arena, but more and more importantly, the biggest fear I have, and this is my little editorial for the whole thing, is that often what happens with these programs, and maybe you've experienced this, particularly with Rush Limbaugh in particular, but G. Gordon Liddy too, is that people will hear these individuals talk about an issue and take what they're saying as if it's the objective truth, that this is reality. Like, I had a student come up and say, "Did you know Bill Clinton ordered the murder of 2 of his political associates in Arkansas," which was something being trumpeted on this video that Jerry Falwell was hawking, the Clinton Chronicles. And I said, "No, I didn't, and I think if you go and research it a little bit, you'll find that might not be true." I certainly don't want to say it's not true, but because I think I hadn't seen the Clinton Chronicles either. I just read about it. But I think it's very, very important for people to separate subjective political discourse, which is clearly what this is, and if you understand that, it can be very, very entertaining. Do I think these people are hate mongers? In the end, I don't think they are. I don't think that's their intent, even G. Gordon Liddy. But I do think that they're entertainers, and they will use any means to an end to entertain. If that means inciting anger and strong emotions on the part of the audience to get them to phone in and talk about their favorite subjects or respond or challenge a guest, or simply to weigh in with their own opinion on an issue, they'll do it. Going back to Oliver North very quickly, one of his other big problems is that people don't like now to call into his program because they know what's going to happen. He's going to basically take it over, and if he doesn't agree with something they've said, he'll basically correct them as they're going along. They'll be saying, "Well, as you know, it's such and such." "Well, no, it's not really that, it's 4." And by the time they get done, you can't even remember what question they were asking or what their comment was, instead of just allowing it to be a natural soundbite where the person is just heard as they are, inarticulate, non-fluencies and the like are just there. You hear the person as they are without break, and then the person comes on and commentates. So it's a fascinating phenomenon in our culture. It certainly has made issue generation in the political sphere much more red hot, particularly with people like these folks saying, fax your congressman today about this or email them. So it certainly spurred a lot more direct response from people. But on the other hand, are these people responsible? And I don't think they are. I think the FCC guidelines have loosened the leash considerably, particularly on the use of profanity and personal slander, to the point where were the old rules in place, these programs could not exist, because they would be basically spending thousands paying penalties to the FCC or risking loss of license because of their violations of format and protocol. And that's what I have to say.
I have 4 comments to make before I get into my presentation this morning. First of all, Bob was talking about Jerry Falwell, the Clinton Chronicles, the video which claimed, among other things, that there certainly could have been a conspiracy in the death of Vince Foster. And I gave a presentation on that at the 1996 SCA convention in San Diego, and I'd certainly be willing to make dubs of my video if you'd like to watch them. Second, Bob made a couple of very salient points when he was talking at the end about the talk radio programs. What we have now, in large measure, could not have been available without the 1987 repeal of the Fairness Doctrine by the FCC. That way you don't have to worry about right of reply time or editorial time. Many of those items are now really dealt with on an individual basis by the stations. The stations, just because someone wants to complain about an individual who's on the air, that doesn't necessarily mean they have the right to go on the air and discuss it. Third, we had another presenter originally scheduled here for this morning. Unfortunately, he could not be with us. And fourth, in his presentation, he was also talking about something that I had in my video pertaining to Rush Limbaugh. In fact, I do have a clip from the Rush Limbaugh television program, which has now been canceled, of Louis Farrakhan, one of the 3 people I'm going to be talking about here this morning before I show you my edited videotape. And you'll hear one comment from Rush, but basically it's a soundbite from the program. It's not something where Rush is commentating on this particular issue. But as I mentioned, I do have some comments, and I'll show you my video on the subject, Bigotry is Not Monochromatic. Many of you may recall, I believe it was either in late 1993 or early 1994, there was a Chronicle of Higher Education article which discussed some very controversial statements by a gentleman whose name is Khalid Abdul Muhammad. He'd made a number of statements which were controversial because they contained anti-white, anti-Semitic comments. At the time, Mr. Muhammad was a spokesman for he was then the spokesman for Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan. And one of the things you may notice if you watch C-SPAN is that oftentimes when the House or Senate is not in session, a number of events from universities are going to be on. In fact, we're trying to get one of the slots for C-SPAN and C-SPAN 2 for our institution for something which is coming up before the end of the year. And there was an event called Unity Nation which took place in 1994 on the campus of Howard University. And it was quite controversial. In fact, the comments that you're going to see from Khalid Abdul Muhammad this morning come from that particular C-SPAN program. But again, what you do is you either by telephone or by email send the specifics of the program information, and then the C-SPAN assignment editor decides whether to cover or not to cover that particular event. Well, obviously, since these very controversial statements had been made by Khalid Abdul Muhammad, that brought a lot more media attention to the event, and as a result, C-SPAN and a number of national networks covered this particular event. But in my case today, with the panel purpose being hate speech, what I want to take a look at are comments which are either perpetuated or tacitly supported by 3 individuals. And this is from the Nation of Islam. The first individual you're going to look at again is Muhammad, from whom I have 5 clips. The founder of Unity Nation, then a student at Howard University, Malik Shabazz, and Minister Louis Farrakhan. But I want to talk about Khalid Abdul Muhammad first, because a number of his clips are going to be quite provocative in terms of the epithets. In fact, he was suspended by Farrakhan for them. Ironically, the clip which you're going to see from the Rush Limbaugh program shows that even though Farrakhan has suspended him, he doesn't necessarily back off from the statements that were made by Muhammad. So, not long after the clips are seen, one of the first things you're going to look at is the attempted assassination on the life of Khalid Abdul Muhammad in early 1994. In fact, that takes place not very long after the comments that you're going to be watching. This took place at the University of California, Riverside, the attempted assassination where he was shot in the legs, and I have a CBS report for you to watch. Now, when you take a look at what's taking place at Unity Nation, the audience is predominantly African American. The audience is really getting into Muhammad's remarks, many of which are quite controversial. In fact, I'd like you to pay particular attention to a clip where he talks about Colin Ferguson. Now, you may remember Colin Ferguson as being the individual who was convicted of being the individual who got onto a Long Island commuter train and shot a number of white people, some of whom died. One of the statements you're going to hear from Mr. Muhammad is something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing here, God put Colin Ferguson on that train. And he puts Colin Ferguson in terms of Nat Turner almost as being an African-American hero. Now, the second person that you'll see on the videotape this afternoon is going to be Malik Zulu Shabazz, the then Howard University student. One of the first comments you're going to be taking a look at is something where he supports the election of Marion Barry, who was then running for election to the seat which he had vacated as mayor of Washington, D.C. And he also makes anti-Semitic statements. In fact, he makes one about an individual for the Washington Post along the lines of, quote, he makes the Jews pee in their pants, end quote. Now, he also supports Khalid Abdul Muhammad as being a scholarly spokesman, unofficially at this time, for Louis Farrakhan. And he's very prominent in the belief, on the second clip that you're going to be watching this morning, that Muhammad should have the opportunity, the right, the privilege, to speak at the Million Man March, something which didn't happen. Now, in terms of time compression, the first Shabazz quote comes from the 1994 Unity Nation event, and the second quote comes at an event not at Howard University, but in the Washington, D.C. area, the day before the Million Man March takes place. And he felt, as well as many people in the audience, that Muhammad should have the opportunity to speak. Well, obviously, that was not going to happen because that would take the focus away from the march, someone who had made those very dramatic comments. Third this morning, Louis Farrakhan. As you know, he received a great deal of acclaim for organizing the Million Man March, even though I believe the D.C. Park estimate had it roughly at about 400 to 600,000 individuals. But his credibility came into widespread disrepair after he was criticized not long after the Million Man March for going to Africa and the Middle East. He visited a number of primarily non-democratic authoritarian countries. He went to Iran, he went to Libya, he went to Nigeria. You may remember that the leader of Libya, Colonel Gaddafi, was going to offer $1 billion to Farrakhan to try to help the African American community in the United States, which the State Department would not allow to happen. Now, I have 3 clips of Farrakhan which I'm going to show you. The first one is the statement from Rush Limbaugh which announces the Muhammad censure. But he goes off on a very bizarre anti-U.S. diatribe, and he takes off after George Washington and a number of other American icons, and it really is quite bizarre. Also, Harry Truman. So even though he is trying to censure Khalid Abdul Muhammad, what he does in fact is to, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, tacitly support him. The second clip is from Mike Wallace from 60 Minutes, where a number of individuals who felt he had finally the status that he deserved, all of a sudden that was wiped away when he decided to go on the trip to Africa. But in this case, I think you'll find Farrakhan viewing himself as being really more of a visionary, with the quote being along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing here, many of your great patriots aren't necessarily viewed as patriots in the time they are alive. The quality of what they have done is realized much after the fact. And a third clip from C-SPAN is a long soundbite where he is giving an acceptance speech for being the Black Newspaper Association Newsmaker of the Year. And he comes across in this case as somewhat of a martyr, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Now, the videotape in terms of the voiceover clips runs just over 20 minutes. I made them a little bit longer because our third participant is not here today, and I really wanted you to get a feel for what Khalid Abdul Muhammad is saying in terms of the anti-white, anti-Semitic remarks. In fact, there is so much footage here that I really could not show you, including a gentleman whose name is Maddox. He was involved in the Tawana Brawley case. Many people would call it the Tawana Brawley hoax. And one of the clips, which I thought about showing but decided not to, just in terms of the time constraints inherent, obviously, was that he views, Maddox that is, views Khalid Abdul Muhammad in the 1990s almost as a figure similar to Malcolm X, where, of course, the analogy being, well, if Louis Farrakhan is the 1990s head of the Nation of Islam, that would put him on a par in the 1960s with the head of the Nation of Islam at that time. So it's really interesting to take a look at that, because he'll say, or I believe one of the people on the tape says, the 6 is a 9 turned upside down. So you can be the judge of that. Anyway, what I would like you to also take a look at, especially at the end, is how Farrakhan is going to, again, try to really support Muhammad after he is shot, get a feeling for that, and after that, the video pretty much speaks for itself, as I said. Now, this lasts roughly about 20 minutes, and I have a few voiceovers interspersed in between. And after the videotape has been shown, what we'll do is have our respondent, Professor Deaton from Transylvania University, make a few comments, and after that, we would like to talk about some material either pertaining to Mr. Glenn's presentation on talk radio or this one, and it'll be coming up shortly. The first piece of video, as I mentioned, is going to be from the CBS Morning Newscast in early 1994.
Khalid Abdul Muhammad, the fiery former spokesman for the Nation of Islam, was shot in the leg. 2 others, reportedly bodyguards, were wounded as well, one seriously. The gunfire rang out as a reporter for CBS-owned station KCBS, Saida Pagan, was about to do a live report. Police had to rescue the alleged gunman, dragging him from the crowd, which had turned on him and beat him after the shots were fired.
I was just standing up there. We were listening to him answering questions. And then all of a sudden the guy came in a dress suit, and he just started shooting.
The shooting occurred in a parking lot at the University of California, Riverside, just after Muhammad had delivered one of his trademark caustic speeches.
Don't you let no hook-nosed, bagel-eating, lox-eating, perpetrating a fraud.
In Los Angeles Saturday, it was more of the same.
I don't believe in we shall overcome. I believe in we shall overrun. I believe we should lift every voice and sing. Yes, lift every voice and sing. But at the same time, God damn it, you better lift every fist and swing too.
Muhammad was suspended as spokesman for Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan after a November speech widely criticized as anti-Semitic. This morning, police have in custody a black man suspected of trying to assassinate this controversial figure. Bill Whitaker, CBS News, Los Angeles.
The attempted assassination of Khalid Abdul Muhammad in 1994 marked the end of a turbulent time for the former national spokesman to Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan. Muhammad was stripped of his spokesman duties after making comments viewed as anti-Semitic and anti-white. What strategies does Muhammad use to provoke his audience? Does he embellish facts or go out of his way to incite strong reactions? Here are some clips representative of Muhammad's fiery and controversial rhetoric.
We set forth here tonight that the Black Holocaust is 100 times worse than the so-called Jew Holocaust. Why do we even need to make a comparison? Because it was all no good President Buck-Tooth Jimmy Carter who stepped out and stepped forward when they were beginning to prepare to build the Jewish Holocaust Memorial. It was Jimmy Carter who General David Eisenhower. General David Eisenhower made similar statements that we read and we saw on the walls of the Jewish Holocaust Memorial yesterday, making the world to believe that this was the most overpowering crime and atrocity against humankind in the history of all time. Everyone has come and said that it is the worst Holocaust that has ever existed, but all of a sudden when we come out on you, you now back down and claim that you never made a comparison. Well, tonight I'm going to make a comparison. We're going to lay the case out and see which Holocaust is the most dreadful, which Holocaust is the most vicious and bestial Holocaust, most bloody Holocaust ever recorded in the annals of time. But you want to deny us because you owe us reparations and you don't want to pay up today. The so-called Jew Holocaust. And I say so-called Jew because he's not a real Jew. He's a Johnny-come-lately Jew who just crawled out of the caves and hills of Europe just a few days ago. So you're not even a real Jew, buddy. So I'm no longer national assistant, no longer national spokesman, no longer national representative, no longer even a minister in the Nation of Islam. So nothing I say now can you attempt to use against God's man, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. None of my words can you attempt to use against him. You took a calculated risk that I would turn on my teacher. 30 years ago, we played out the same history with the history of Minister Malcolm X, El-Hajj, Malik Shabazz, Brother Omar Wali, and the most honorable Elijah Muhammad during the 60s. But the 6 is a 9 turned upside down. And these are the 90s. We're going to turn the 6 of the 60s right side up in the 90s and put a positive period behind that history of Elijah and Malcolm. There is no Malcolm without Elijah, and there is no Khalid without Farrakhan. Make no mistake about it. So you've gotten me busted, but you can't use my words against my teacher and my spiritual father anymore. And you've gotten me busted, and now I'm going to go buck wild on your behind. I'm not giving you no kind of praise today. All praise is due to Allah. Going buck wild on you. Not only will the so-called imposter Jew beg the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, not only will the other white folks beg him, but these half-baked, half-fried, boot-licking, butt-licking, butt-dancing, bamboozled, punkified, sissified, pasteurized, homogenized niggas and Uncle Toms will beg him too before it's all over. Oh, boot-licking Major Owens. Oh, boot-licking Charlie Rangel. Oh, bootlicking, buck dancing, scratching, shuffling, messy Jesse Jackson. And keep. I am a somebody. I am a somebody. Keep hope alive. I am a somebody. I don't rightly know who the hell I am, but I am. Somebody. I am somebody. caught the New York Railroad train just a few days ago. I say to every one of you, if you leave Colin Ferguson in that jail to be beat up by these crackers, now it has come out by some of the black officers that this happens all the time, where they set black inmates up in these jails and penitentiaries, and in particular there in Nassau County, and pulled all the black officers out and the black inmates so they could jump on Brother Colin Ferguson, because they were mad with him for catching the Long Island train and killing all them white folks. I love Colin Ferguson. I have no official position, so I can say I love him. I love Colin Ferguson. And I say to every one of you with your red, black, and green, your kente cloth, your gele, your grand booba, if you will denounce and repudiate and condemn Colin Ferguson, you should never utter the name of Nat Turner again from your mouth, because Colin Ferguson is a modern-day Nat Turner. He didn't get on that train of his own. God put him on that train. God spoke to Nat Turner. God spoke to Denmark Vesey. God spoke to Colin Ferguson and said, I want you to catch the Long Island train today. Let the church say amen. Let the church say amen again. Let the church say amen one more time. They all fought over the male organ as to who would take that home. Don't lie and say you didn't. It's the same with your no-good, freakish rabbis. I read it in the Jerusalem Post. I call out any of your scholars. I saw a little cracker that was in here a little while ago. Well, Richard Cohen ran out of here like a screaming, flaming. You call newsrooms. And so you have the evening 6 o'clock to 5 o'clock news. And the 10 o'clock news. You want to hide. We call you out to debate. Give us your best minds. Give us the best so-called Jew you got. Give us a whole team of them. Give us a whole forum with nothing but your best mind. But you run from us. You hide from us. And I say to every black man in this audience, when the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan gives the call sometime within a year or so for 1 million black men to converge on Washington, D.C., not to sing "We Shall Overcome," every black man should be here. And black woman, if you got a black man who won't go, you should make sure he gets out of the house. You should make sure that he answers the call.
One of the leaders of Unity Nation, former Howard University student Malik Shabazz, is every bit as confrontational as Khalid Abdul Muhammad. Shabazz also uses the C-SPAN forum to attack Jews and those who disagree with the concept of racial separation.
We will take your money and fight on the front lines for you. So as the receptacles are passed around, please assist us in the work that we're doing. Who we supporting for mayor? Who we supporting for the next mayor? Who? Marion Barry. No question about it. Unity Nation officially endorses Marion Barry to return to the mayor's office as a symbol for the resurrection and the rise of all of our people. We back, Marion Barry. I know some of you don't like it. You like Sharon Pratt Kelly. You love her. This goes out to the babies and to the future. The black man will not be defeated. The black man is on the road to liberation. This is what we're here for, black man. This is the greatest day I've ever seen in the history of my life. All praise is due to Allah. As you stand on your feet, if you miss us, you come on by and give it to us. We want to bring on now that bad, bald-headed black man. We want to bring him on now. That man who was repudiated by the House, repudiated by the Senate, repudiated by the Congress, but he's still speaking strong. Repudiated by the president, repudiated by the vice president, but he's still strong and on the road. We want to bring on that man who took a bullet in the leg, and stood right up, and he's still strong. Every black man, if you're shot down, stand up and fight. Fight with the power of Almighty God. We want to bring on the man who's been with Minister Louis Farrakhan since the very beginning. We want to bring on a man, former minister, West Regional Minister, and minister at Mosque 27 in Los Angeles, California. We want to bring on the former Supreme Captain, head of the mighty Fruit of Islam. We want to bring on the former national spokesman for the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. We want to bring on the national assistant to Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. We want to bring on a member of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey's UNIA. We want to bring on a man who gives the white man nightmares. We want to bring on a man who makes the Jews pee in their pants at night. He's like black raid on white roaches. You know who I'm talking about. Who am I talking about?
Louis Farrakhan received widespread acclaim for organizing the Million Man March in Washington, D.C. However, his rhetoric, both before and after the march, has hardly been magnanimous. He is shown in a series of clips attacking the U.S. government, those who disagree with his foreign policy ideas, and many who feel he is an anti-Semitic racial separatist.
This is George Washington, who is on a $1 bill. So, is honored and respected, and nobody has repudiated or asked anybody to repudiate. But he was the Indian killer before he became president. And he killed Indians from Virginia all the way to Canada. And he killed men, women, and children. This is an apology speech. General Amherst, whom a college is named after in his honor. Nobody's repudiating him, but he's the one that put smallpox in blankets and sent them up on the Indian, not reservation, but where the Indians were, to kill who? Men, women, and children. When Truman decided to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he didn't say what Brother Khalid said, but he did. Kill men, women, children, blind, crippled, crazy. And when we came over, not on the Nina, or Deaton, or the Santa Maria, but in the whole ship, millions of us lost our lives. Men, women, children.
Then he re-emerged for that tour of Africa and the Middle East. To observers like Dr. C. Eric Lincoln, a distinguished black historian and professor emeritus at Duke University, who has studied the Nation of Islam since the 1950s, Farrakhan's trip squandered a great opportunity. Professor Lincoln told me he was disgusted with your trip to the Middle East and to Africa. He said, he blew it. After the Million Man March, he feels that you had what you were after. You had put yourself in a position as a leader of the entire black community in America, which you had never had before, and then that you just threw it away with the trip to Africa. Now, this is from a man,
Yes,
scholar, been a guest in your home,
yes.
loves you and your wife.
And I love him. Let me say this. There are many people like Dr. Lincoln who think just like that. They were hurt because they watched my struggle. And they said, now he has arrived, okay?
Right.
And they felt not only that I had arrived for me, I had arrived for them because secretly they had wanted to embrace Louis Farrakhan. And just as they were about to put their arms around me, I went to Africa and the Middle East, and to quote them, I blew it.
You spoke, in their view, against your own country.
You know, some of your best patriots are those who never went along with the government position. Listen, everyone that stepped back from me, they didn't run away. They're behind a tree. I got up after the Million-Man March, and I had no desire to speak anymore. I looked in Newsweek magazine, and I saw a caricature by a cartoonist. He had the tomb of Martin Luther King Jr., and on that tomb, I have a dream. And then a caricature of Louis Farrakhan, I have a scheme. The dreamer is dead, the schemer lives. What is the subtle message there? Mr. Rowan writes, Farrakhan is a curse that just won't go away. Will you now send me away? Brothers and sisters, this is a dangerous time. And that's why the NNPA should be applauded, because they had the courage to make Farrakhan Man of the Year. People call you and say, why would you do that? He's controversial. But I heard there was a big argument in the boardroom of Time magazine, because they also said there that I should be Man of the Year at Time magazine. But they said, how can we do this? So Newt Gingrich won out. I heard, I don't really know that that's true. It's rumors, you know, and you all print rumors.
Khalid Abdul Muhammad, Malik Shabazz, and Louis Farrakhan used divisive strategies to gain attention in the public marketplace of ideas. These concepts fail in large measure due to their sense of collective self-righteousness, their way or else. They, in the end, have marginalized themselves to the point of being largely irrelevant in American political discourse.
And of course, with Farrakhan, he does play up the martyr complex. There are a number of interviews, which I didn't have time to show on the videotape, where he clearly believes at some time in his life, and he is 64 this year, he feels as if he's going to be assassinated and become a martyr in the tradition of Malcolm X, or Medgar Evers, or the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And if you would like a dub of that videotape, I'll be happy to give you business cards at the end of our panel presentation this morning, and certainly welcome to have them. Our respondent this morning is Professor Gary Deaton from Transylvania University.
Okay, now how much time do we have?
Got 16 minutes.
Okay, I'll keep this pretty brief in case you all have some questions that you'd like to ask. And I think the one thing that I saw being relevant in one of the things I saw being relevant in combining the two presentations is the role that emotionalism plays. And I think the fear that Bob expressed at the end of his presentation about how the sources become objective reality rather than being seen as someone who has an agenda that they're trying to put out their agenda. Rather, they are viewed as journalists, but as Bob pointed out, what they really are activists. On the other hand, in Jim's presentation, we see people who are combining elements of, there's so much of sort of familial rhetoric with brothers and sisters. There's this heavy dose of religious rhetoric, and yet you also have Muhammad using the sort of most base of taking God's name in vain references in the midst of sort of a religious rhetoric. And so you have this combination of these very emotional kinds of rhetorical strategies being presented as if this were the truth or the way it is or the way it ought to be. And I think the couple things I would say are that in both presentations we learned a lot about that area. We learned a lot in Bob's presentation about talk radio and about the different styles of talk radio and about the different people. And in Jim's, we certainly learned that, as your title says, bigotry isn't monochromatic. And we learned how this gets done. And I guess what I'd like to see in follow-ups to these would be even more of a critical eye that looks at why is it this happens. I just read an article yesterday that asserts that the cult suicides were largely linked to this whole phenomenon in our culture of emotionalism and people being from this Thomas Sowell was arguing from kindergarten on, we're taught to deal with, well, how do you feel about it? Not what does it say or what were the facts or what is the knowledge that we should have, but rather let's role play this and let's see how you feel as a result of this interaction. And Sowell's argument is that then plays through, and we see in these two papers at least some instances where emotionalism becomes the dominant factor. And so I guess what I'd like to see is us examine and maybe take to task. Bob, I had a question. You said, are they responsible at the end? And I got the sense that what you meant is, are they held responsible? And no, they're not because the standards aren't applied. But maybe what we should be pursuing as communication scholars is, how responsible are they for what they put out there? I mean, shouldn't we be holding them responsible for these ideas and for the potential results in both cases, in the cases of both of these papers? Not only is Muhammad expressing support for Colin Ferguson, but one might suppose that there's some of what Colin Ferguson did could be a result of a lot of this kind of rhetoric, this kind of hate speech. And so I think that we need to look at these things critically, and that also includes, in all cases, the motivation. I would like to maybe in the future take a look at some of the, why is Muhammad, I don't remember the name of the second speaker, was it Shabazz?
Malik Shabazz.
And Farrakhan, why are they able to command these audiences? Why are they able to get these responses? And where are, you saw in some of the audience shots that they did, where are the ambivalent responses? And what's causing those? And even the negative, you saw some people who were, trying to look away, trying not to make eye contact, refusing to give the, can I get an amen from the house? This whole, the way the church works, and then they're picking out, certain parts of the way sort of church services work as these people have been socialized, as their particular audience has been socialized through their own religious experiences, and then applying that to a non-church rhetoric. And I think it might also be interesting, a third paper that would have been nice here would be to look at the rhetoric of the sort of religious right and how that does a lot of the same things that in different ways that are being done by the speakers that Jim showed us. A lot of very emotional talk, a lot of use the socialization that the people have experienced to get them to buy into a political agenda through a religious agenda, even though the two may not really be sort of linked if you think it through in a logical way. And so I think these were very informative, thought-provoking kinds of papers, and I think it's something that it allows us to go forward and do even more of a critical analysis and say, okay, why is this happening and what can we do about it? And the one area I thought especially of is in the black community. I mean, a lot of the statistics that we're seeing, there are some real significant problems out there that are reasons why people are looking for something. And I think if we had, the religious right thing, again, with the cult, a lot of people have been writing about why is it that there's so much emptiness? Why would people say, I've been on this earth 31 years and I've never found anything that made me feel happy until this, let's go up to join the spaceship following the Hale-Bopp Comet. I mean, what is it that makes people this empty that they would look for this kind of solution? And why are these, whatever, talk radio, be a ditto head, follow the Nation of Islam, join a cult, why are these things happening? And so I'd like to see us maybe do more of that as communication scholars, try to figure out some more of this and maybe get that information out to our culture.
And as in everything that we're looking at, and I'm sure Bob had this problem as well, there is so much information out there about talk show hosts. I mean, Bob could do a presentation just on one or even one program that an individual is doing in terms of the construction and the way in which they're trying to provoke action or provoke thought. And I know in my case, I had hours and hours of videotape. And it really becomes a matter of, you don't want to take anything out of context, and certainly in the case of Muhammad, I didn't. And in the case of Farrakhan, what I was trying to do was show his defense of Muhammad, and then show him talking about his foreign policy, what he feels the United States would do, but also the important thing as martyr with the presentation at the Newspaper Association. So if you have any comments, we'd like to hear them. Yeah.
I thought they were both fascinating presentations, so I really have a lot of questions. So I'll try to get them down so people have a chance too. But Bob, maybe I've been in too many of these gender studies presentations, but I was noticing, I think on a couple of yours, you're making the point of these entertainers, I think as you call them, are popular with men, aged 18 to 20.
Well, in particular, G. Gordon Liddy is, yeah. He's much more popular with men than women.
So that would not be true as much so of the others.
Right. I think Don Imus is pretty popular with women. I think Michael Reagan would appeal more to women, and I say that superficially. I haven't seen the Arbitron numbers. That's just a gut reaction because he comes across as a softer and gentler. He has a softer and gentler tone. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you if you could comment any on why they might appeal more to men.
Tone and background. I mean, G. Gordon Liddy comes across like, a man's man, and he's got this really intense, almost psychopathic quality to him. Oliver North, I would suffice to guess, probably does very well with female listeners because of his ethos as a rather attractive movie star-like figure, at least dating back to 87. That was corrected. But a lot of it is that the image, some people still have him as this handsome young Marine in the uniform, even though it's been 10 years and he's, a little older. He's got graying hair and all. But even in Virginia, he had women coming up to him in droves when he ran for the Senate, asking for his autograph. Who knows whether they're going to vote for him or not. But they were like, Ollie, I want your autograph. And his partisans, who were bankrolled by the Christian Coalition in Virginia, I did a paper on Ollie North, can you tell, called themselves Ollie's Army during the Virginia Senate race. And they followed him around almost like a cult, almost like a group of groupies. And a lot of them were women aged 40 to 65 who thought Ollie was adorable. He was like their favorite grandson. So I would imagine that there are a great number of women 40 to 65 who listen to Ollie's show. But I don't know if that's enough because, like I said, his failings as an interviewer and really he sounded good when he had a real rehearsed presentation like in 87. But when you get him in that live static sort of thing where he has to be interviewer, then he has to be presenter, then he has to be, he doesn't handle that as well. It's not necessarily his fault. He wasn't trained to do it. He was thrown on the radio as so many people are because of something they did in their life. Pete Rose has a radio show, folks, and personally, Pete Rose is awful. But why is he on the radio? Because he's an infamous celebrity, the man who gambled on baseball and lost his ticket to the Hall of Fame. And that's not unique. Radio has always been a bastion for people who could sell soap to speak, and get people's attention and sell, advertising dollars who are not necessarily ready for prime time on television. I think Rush Limbaugh is a real good example. Rush Limbaugh doesn't look good on TV, but he sounds great on radio. A lot of people sound great on radio who don't, look real hot when you get them in the TV glare. So radio is a unique medium. Don Imus, is kind of a scuzzy-looking guy, but, he's hysterical on radio if you don't, because you can create, like you do when you read a book, create your own vision of what the person looks like. One thing, let me just stick this in that I didn't mention, is the entrepreneurial linkage. I went through the internet, and you can do this too. And every one of these folks, from Michael Reagan to G. Gordon Liddy, they all have a newsletter. They all have CD-ROMs and cassette tapes you can get. If you can't get enough for the radio, you can get their life philosophy. They've all got books and publications. The Limbaugh Letter is an example for Rush. And they are actively trying to establish themselves, not just in terms of listen to my radio program. They want people to literally become totally connected to them so that they have a fan following across a variety of mediums. Including the internet, where they actually will go through and actually have a chat line with their listeners. The other thing that needs to be mentioned, Dr. Hausman at Southern Miss has done a study of this, and I think it's a real good one, the numbers from Cena Barrow, and that is that of those who listen to a talk radio program, only 3% will call in. And those 3% have to be uniquely motivated individuals. And that's the other thing. These shows rely on pyrotechnics. They've got to have a train wreck occur to keep audience interest. Otherwise, it's just dry policy wonk talk. And so the people that call in tend to be the ones, and there tend to be a coterie of them. You'll hear, "Oh, John, thanks for calling in again," because they screen their calls. And so if John wasn't very exciting last time, John's going to get to sit on the line and never get on for 3 months. But if John is really hot and exciting, and he interacts well with Rush or interacts well with G. Gordon Liddy, he's going to get on again. And so even the listeners play the role of entertainer, both in terms of their connection with these celebrity radio talk show hosts, but also in terms of their own performance with saying, "Yeah, Rush, you're absolutely right. I can't believe, that people want to reform welfare reform. They've got to be out of their mind." Or, "You're absolutely right, G. Gordon, G-man. There's absolutely no way that Bill Clinton wasn't involved in that murder. We all know he's a scuzzball." And so, again, a lot of the attacking, some of the most hostile and actually libelous statements that are made by listeners who call in. But very few listeners call in. Far more people are like voyeurs. They don't participate. And that's what the newsletter, the CD-ROM, the books are designed to do. Don't call in? Okay, fine. We didn't get you that way. We'll get you with the newsletter. We'll get you with the CD-ROM. We'll get you with the book. We'll get you connected to this program, and we'll make money off you. I mean, to be skeptical and cynical, that's what it's about. It's designed, and that's why I say they're entertainers. But they may say hateful things, but that's just a means to an end. So.
I think despite Bob's evidence to the contrary, one reason why the gender thing might be different is that masculine communicators tend to be more, right to the point and just right there. And you said, when you said the stuff about, like, you're right on, it's just this way. And that feminine communicators tend to be more, there's a breadth of, there are all these different concepts and there are all these things that we want to talk about, and maybe that's why.
Well, there's powerless language use if you buy into that theory, and there's also equivocation. But the other thing is, these programs, dating back to Paul Harvey, are report talk, not rapport talk. Okay, if you want rapport talk, call one of these counseling shows, and I'm not even sure she's a good example, Dr. Laura, who's very hot right now. She's
not masculine. She's
she is.
You did that.
Right.
That's stupid.
Right.
You're wrong. You're immoral.
I think in some ways it is, and also it's a lot of reporting. G. Gordon Liddy, Rush, they all start out with a review of the news. Michael Reagan does the same thing. It's on his webpage. A review of the stories he's going to cover.
G. Gordon Liddy reads the newspaper.
Right. They all go through the newspaper. It's become almost pro forma. C-SPAN does it too. They have that thing where they go through the daily newspapers, and when they have a call-in, they ask people, what's your headline newspaper say today? And they use that as kind of a foundation step early in the program to get subjects out that are going to be the topics of the day. And that's not something that, a woman could do it, certainly, but it tends to be a more masculine thing when we think of the archetypal thing of Dagwood and Blondie, where Dagwood's got the newspaper up and he's flipping through it. Now, do women read the newspaper? Sure. Do they keep up with the news? Yes. But it's just more formulated and accepted, I think, when a man is doing it. Now, what we're waiting for, obviously, is for a really successful woman talk show host who can develop a style that's somewhere between to report talk and report talk. And that's happening in sports. You know, the fabulous sports babe. There are a couple of people on ESPN that are a couple of women that are developing sports talk shows for them on television. But in the news area, it isn't as accepted. I can't think of a woman that has burst out and said, I am the female version of Rush Limbaugh. And I think that's because that wouldn't work well. But if there's a female version that's somewhere between Rush Limbaugh and the other end of the spectrum, that might work real well.
There are a number of women, of course, who are quite prominent at a local or regional level, but haven't necessarily broken out on a national scale in terms of political talk or provocative talk. If you take a look at the numbers right now, Rush Limbaugh is by far number one in terms of syndication, but Dr. Laura is second. And the ironic part about Imus is that if you take a look at his ratings, he is not number one in New York. Howard Stern is. But
that was the second thing I was going to bring up. Stern, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask about, I'm sure, you obviously had very good reasons for leaving Stern out of this. Just, you were going for a scale here?
I was also focusing mainly on the people that are dealing with political issues. I focused more on that. Now, I know that Stern deals with that. But selfishly, I also picked people that I had spent hours and hours and hours listening to their style, listening to their topic choices, listening to their format, and I was just more familiar with these folks than I was. Howard Stern isn't in our area. You know, I live in the Bible Belt, and they wouldn't touch Howard Stern. And even WTN doesn't do it.
Sort of sanitize himself with the movie, you know, this going legit.
Could be.
It will hurt inevitably, or eventually, his radio ratings. Because he's always been...
I don't listen to him, so I can't
I don't know. This is kind of an interesting dichotomy because Bob is speech, debate, forensics, and I'm broadcast journalism. I would say that when we see the Howard Stern movie, we do see the curtain part, because it shows that basically we are watching Howard Stern as an entertainer, as a professional wrestler, so to speak. That's the persona he's created, from being a self-described nerd to being this popular individual with the Louis XIV hairstyle.
You have to keep in mind, too, in let me look at the date here, 1995, just a year and a half ago, G. Gordon Liddy was named the top radio talk show host by the National Association of Radio Talk Show Hosts, and of course that was right after the ATF comment. And what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that the industry is interested in selling ad dollars. They are not interested in content that is suitable for children. As long as these people get the ratings, they can say anything they want because of the restrictions on content have so been eliminated. The fairness doctrine elimination and the elimination in terms of enforcement of these fines. I mean, there used to be a time when Don Imus was in Cleveland where his station would repeatedly pay about $5,000 a week in fines because they'd make more than enough in ad revenue to cover the fines. Bob and Tom out of Indianapolis, when they first started, were paying about $10,000 a month in fines, but they were making their station through satellite fees and everything else, making more than enough income in terms of ad revenue and satellite fees to offset that. So it was worth the penalty. And what's happening is, or has in the last 5 years, those enforcement fees have either not been enforced at all, so they're getting a free ride, or they haven't been as much. Because for a problem to occur, listeners have to say, this is disgusting, I don't want it on the radio, or I think you've slandered me, and I'm going to seek reparation. And of course, we just had the movie, the Falwell case, public figure who was libeled in a satiric cartoon by Larry Flynn in Hustler. That case is very important to why public figures can't run for cover anymore. Even if they are slandered, it's just considered part of the political discourse. And of course, that's the outgrowth of the whole civility debate that we're going through. Where do you draw the line? And I do think, do these people cross the line? Absolutely. Are they offensive? Absolutely. There are times when I listen to somebody like Tom and Bob and I go, this is really tasteless stuff that not even a junior high student would find interesting or humorous. Other times, they're very funny, and it's adult humor, and it's not even dirty humor. So it's hit and miss. G. Gordon Liddy, for all his pyrotechnics, can be very intelligent and insightful. I think he's a very intelligent guy. Like I said, great vocabulary, very entertaining. But the problem is, should I believe every word he says? I don't think so. And I
Very-
hope listeners don't either.
Very quickly, because we have to get out of here, you wanted to make a comment also about the Nation of Islam presentation.
I've got
You missed
copies of
it
this if you
Oh,
want
yeah,
the outline.
yeah, I think that the last part.
Take two, they're small.
About Farrakhan being largely irrelevant.
Well, I really meant 2 out of 3. He's still relevant. His credibility is pretty much shot. Even after the Million Man March, you see the CNN poll graphic indicating that he has 53% support after the Million Man March in the African American community. So it's really 2 out of 3.
In the African American community.
Yes,
This is not.
and that was in the aftermath of the Million Man March.
And the
Sorry,
other question, this
wasn't
is
able
very
to attend. I
eye-opening
wanted
because
actually a copy of
I'm
the
not familiar
papers.
with these particular
We don't
things.
have a
Paper per
Uh-huh.
se, but I have an outline of my comments.
Gary,
Scott.
Gary, could you give him? Muhammad had said
And
something about
great. This is what I
owing us a
saw. Yeah.
restitution.
Well, primarily in monetary terms. But what I can tell you is this has been highly controversial. In fact, the title of the program, as you heard on the videotape, was The Black Holocaust. And that's one of the things that Muhammad is hanging his hat on, in the respect that, in the quotation, the Black Holocaust is 100 times greater than what he calls, his quote, the so-called Jew Holocaust, close quote. So that's what they're trying to do when they talk about reparations. It's not anything that Farrakhan talks about in any great depth. And he got a tremendous amount of publicity around the world when he made this tour. But again, you saw from the Mike Wallace interview on 60 Minutes, a lot of individuals who felt Farrakhan had done a great thing by organizing the Million Man March felt, what is he doing? Now he has credibility, and he sees Muammar Gaddafi, he talks to people in Iran, he goes to some of these countries where democracy has never been enforced, especially Nigeria. And there was a quote, which I did not use, where Mike Wallace really irritates Farrakhan when Wallace says Nigeria is probably one of the most democratic and worst countries he has ever been to. And Farrakhan goes on about a 2.5-minute rant in that particular case, stating that, hey, look, you are in no right to judge. You have no right to judge what they are involved with. So.
Well, is he working for money being paid to the Nation of Islam? Or, I mean, I just wondered, what concrete evidence does he want to see that...
I don't know. I think sometimes...
He doesn't know, he hasn't said that.
Not really.
We're not
I think,
there yet.
No, not really. What they're trying to do, again, like what Bob was talking about with talk radio, is really provoke thought oftentimes more than anything else.